Before we begin working on our felt monster and cutting our felt, we need to create a design for what we want the final product to look like. So everybody's going to take a full-size piece of paper, fold it in half, and open it up so that you have a seam running down the center, and I just drew a line to make it show up a little bit better. You're going to draw the front of your character on one side and the back on the other side. It's important that you create some kind of design on the front of your character as well as the back. And the back can be, anything from a pattern to some kind of continuation of the design. You can see the example PowerPoint that was loaded into the classroom to get some ideas as to what you want to create for your character. So I've created this little character that is a cactus in a pot. He's got thorns and some flowers on him, and I've created a design for the front and the back. I decided that I wanted one arm of him to be a little bit bigger than the other, so that's how I drew that. And when I flipped over to draw the other side, I used a little cheat. You might have seen it when I flipped it shut. I flipped the paper shut after I drew the front and pushed on the back side of this paper, and it created a really faint line on the inside of this character just flipped. So I was able to trace over that and get that all drawn out. So if you want to freehand it, that's totally fine. It's not super important that this is absolutely perfect right now, but if you'd like to try that little trick, I find it very helpful. So once you have the design fully drawn out and you've decided what is going to go where, the next step is going to be to work on your template. So I'm going to put my design aside and take out my template paper. Your template paper is a half-size piece of paper. It's important when you're drawing your template that you fit it to this size piece of paper, because this piece is going to fit your piece of felt when you get ready to cut your felt material. So you're going to draw just the outline of your figure. You're not going to include in it anything that might be part of a different color of felt. I want to make the pot out of a different color, so I'm not going to include that, and I don't need to worry about drawing any of the designs on here. All I'm worried about right now is trying to draw this character as big as I can fit him on this piece of paper so that when I go to cut out, I have a guide. Now, this drawing is very important to make sure it looks exactly what you want it to look like when you cut out your felt, because you're going to be using this as a stencil guide to cut your felt fabric, and you don't want to have to make any kind of decisions or changes as you're working on this piece. So once you have your template drawn out, you should be very careful to make sure that nothing on your template is thinner than your finger. When you're working on your character, and this is an example of one here that was never finished, but you can see that both of the legs are the same size, but this one, because it's stuffed, looks a little bit smaller than the unstuffed leg. Remember that when you draw these out, they're going to get a little bit thinner side to side when you add the stuffing, because when you take that flat thing and you put it top to bottom and then you add stuffing, the middle is going to come up, which is going to make the sides go in just a little bit. So you can see here on this one, the leg being a little bit thicker will result in a slightly thinner one later. So you don't want to make the mistake of starting out too thin, because then once you try to add the stuffing and they're sewn together later, they get extremely skinny and very hard to sew or stuff. Once you have your template drawn out and you're sure it's exactly what you want it to look like, you're going to take your scissors and you're going to cut the paper only. And you want to take time to make sure you're cutting right on that line, as neat as you possibly can. And there I have my design. I just have a little bit here that's a little bit off. I'm just going to fix that. There we go. This is going to be your template guide that you're going to use when you're cutting out your felt. You have one large piece of felt, which should be roughly about 11.5 by 9 inches. If your felt is bigger than this, you can trim it down to make a smaller box to start with, or just work with one of the smaller corners. So this is the size that the felt comes pre-cut from the store. And fortunately for us, this is also very close to a half-size piece of paper when we fold it in half. So I'm working with felt that is the same on the front and the back. So I'm going to take my felt very carefully. I'm going to take these two short ends and line them up and then give this a press down. I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut down that flat seam, and I'm going to lift this up a little bit. I'm going to put a little bit of pressure on my scissors, kind of pulling out to the side. And I want to cut a nice straight line so that I have my front and my back cut into two pieces. So once I've cut out the front and the back, I can double check to make sure again that yes, my template does fit. I am going to take my template and I'm going to slide it down. I have a flat part on the bottom of my design, and I'm going to cheat a little bit and use this flat edge of the design so that that's one less line I have to cut. If your design is not flat across the bottom, they have rounded legs or something like that, you can move it sort of up off of that line to allow you room to cut that out. Now, in the bag of supplies that you were given, you have something called a straight pin. And a straight pin is a pin that has one sharp end and one flat one. It looks like a really tiny nail that's very sharp on the end. So I'm going to use these straight pins like an extra set of hands to hold things. So when you put a straight pin into a sewing project, you start by stabbing the pin in through all 3 layers. So I'm stabbing it through the paper, the top layer of felt, and down to the bottom. I'm going to push it, oops, don't lose your template. I'm going to push it about halfway through. So there you can see. And then I'm going to take my felt and my template, and I'm going to bend it a little bit. Now notice I'm bending the fabric and the paper. I'm not bending the pin. I'm just going to take the pin and kind of tip it, just a little pressure to straighten it out. And then I'm going to use that pin to push back out the other side. So if you look carefully, you'll notice the pin is still straight. I did not bend the metal. What I bent was the fabric so that it tipped up and back through. Now it's okay if your fabric bubbles a little bit because everything is bubbling evenly. The felt, the paper, so it's all together. When we do eventually pull these pins out, everything will lay back down flat and line up. So you're going to use your straight pins to secure your template to the felt. You do not need to use all of the pins that were given to you. You just need to secure one piece, one pin in each piece that sticks out. So I've got my head and 2 arms. So I'm going to put one pin in each one of these pieces. And I'm just double checking to make sure my pins are going through all 3 layers. And then I'm going to add one more pin, and this kind of slid off the bottom. That's okay. It's just one more cut I'll have to make there later. And I'm going to add my pin to the bottom here. So you don't need to pin it down, you know, with 15 different pins. Just one pin in each part that'll wiggle around will keep it securely on your felt until you are ready to cut out. Once I have my template secured to my piece of felt, and remember again, we're cutting through both pieces of felt, so there should be 2 layers here. That's going to give me the front and the back of my cactus for my character, so I can sew everything on and then later sew them together and stuff them. You're going to take your scissors and you're going to very carefully and very neatly cut around your template. Now, felt is a material that's a little bit difficult to cut, especially if your scissors aren't the sharpest. So just take your time. And you're trying for nice, smooth, clean cuts. You don't want to keep cutting and cutting where you end up with lots of jagged edges. We want this to look nice, smooth, and clean. So I'm going to slowly cut out. And bring it right up to there. And I'm going to cut straight in here, which is just going to help me kind of get that piece out. So I've got a nice clean cut right into the cactus's armpit. I'm going to take these pieces of extra and just put those aside for later. And then I'm going to continue to cut out around his elbow. And keep going around the whole outside. Now, the general rule of thumb when we're working with cutting out felt, and we do this in the classroom, if the scraps are bigger than a quarter, like a coin, we keep them because you can reuse them for other pieces. You'll see in your bag is a bunch of scrap pieces of felt. We reuse these pieces for other designs. If your pieces are really tiny, smaller than a quarter, these little pieces can be thrown out in the garbage. I like to kind of throw them out as I'm working so that I don't worry about getting confused about what I'm keeping and what I'm not. So I'm just going to continue around here, doing my best to keep it as neat as possible. And just be careful where your fingers are on the other side so that you don't accidentally cut them. I'm going to keep those scraps there and keep cutting around. And I like to cut off little sections as I go because it's less that I have to hold on to. Make sure I'm not stabbing myself with the straight pins. And then down my last line. And trim that last little bottom piece. So I'm going to put my scrap felt off to the side so that I don't confuse it with my project. And now I can look at my piece, see if there's any parts that don't really line up or look like I might have missed a spot. And I think this looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out my straight pins and I'm going to insert them back into this little piece of cardboard so that I don't lose them. It's very important when you're sewing that you are keeping track of all of your sharps because if they catch you off guard, they will not make you very happy when they stab you. So just be really careful with where you're keeping your sharp objects. So I like to keep my pins in either the cardboard or if you have some kind of pin cushion at home that you might use or someone, sews at your house. This is the one that I use personally when I'm sewing, and I keep all of my straight pins in here. It's just filled with rice, so it's heavy and it sits. But either of those, will work. You just want to make sure that you're keeping track of where your pins are.